The first fracture rarely arrives with thunder. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed, in the moments after connection begins to fade. A message that never arrives. A silence that stretches too long. A glance that once carried warmth, but now turns away. We tell ourselves it is nothing, just circumstance, yet the body already feels what the mind resists. The soul registers absence long before the ego admits loss. This is the point where longing becomes a shadow. A woman may sit in the evening light surrounded by familiar walls, but something is missing. It is not just the other person's presence, but a part of her own vitality that seems to have gone with them. And when night falls, the fracture makes itself known more clearly. The dreams arrive. The face reappears. The name echoes unbidden in the silence. Jung taught that what is not integrated returns again and again. We think the past is behind us, but the unconscious is not bound by time. It preserves impressions, sensations, unfinished emotions. The ache of what has been lost is not simply memory, it is energy without a home. This is why the calendar cannot dictate healing. Months may pass, years may turn, but one song, one scent, one passing figure on the street can tear the wound open again. The fracture deepens when pride takes hold. The persona, the mask we wear to face the world, steps forward and declares, "I am fine." Outwardly, she continues with her routine, smiling when expected, nodding politely, carrying on as if untouched. But the unconscious does not obey the mask. It insists on making itself known through restlessness, through sudden heaviness, through the subtle signs that show something unresolved remains. This tension between surface and depth is where suffering grows. On one hand, the demand to appear composed, independent, unaffected. On the other hand, the shadow whispering at night, calling attention to what has been denied. Many ignore this whisper, fearing it will drown them. Yet suppression only magnifies the pressure. What is unacknowledged gathers strength in the dark. Jung described this as the return of the repressed. The truth we refuse to face becomes the very thing that controls us. Notice how this fracture shows itself in everyday life. A woman hears a familiar melody in a cafe and feels tears rise for no apparent reason. A man walks past a stranger wearing the same perfume once carried by someone dear, and suddenly the present collapses under the weight of memory. The unconscious chooses its moments carefully. It does not shout in boardrooms or crowded streets. It waits until the surface softens, until silence leaves space for truth to slip through. Here lies the wound that destabilizes the soul. Not a dramatic betrayal, but the quiet ache of absence. Not always anger, but the sorrow of being unseen. This is where the false belief often takes root, that if silence exists, love must be gone. Yet Jung would remind us that silence is never empty. It is filled with all that has not yet been spoken. The words withheld the emotions, denied the gestures, never completed. The fracture is not proof of indifference. It is proof that something deep remains unresolved. The challenge of this stage is that the ego craves finality. We want to mark the end with a date to say, "It is over now, and I have moved on." But the unconscious does not honor such declarations. It holds on until integration has occurred. This is why longing can feel unreasonable, even humiliating. You tell yourself to stop, yet the dream returns. You assure yourself you are healed, yet the memory still burns. This inner contradiction is not weakness, it is evidence of the depth at which the bond was written into your soul. Every fracture calls attention to a deeper truth. Sometimes it reveals the hunger for recognition, the pain of abandonment, the fear of being unworthy. These are not new wounds, but old ones stirred by recent loss. The shadow seizes its chance to emerge, whispering, "Here I am. You cannot bury me forever." And so the fracture is both external and internal. External because the connection has shifted or broken. Internal because the self must now confront parts it once tried to avoid. To resist this is natural. No one wants to dwell in the ache, but to deny it is to miss its purpose. Longing is not here to torture you. It is here to guide you toward integration. It insists you turn inward to see where you have abandoned yourself while hoping another would complete you. This is the wound beneath the wound, the place where we confuse presence with worth. We forget that the ache we feel for the other also points to the ache we have long carried within. The first fracture, then, is sacred in its own way. It shakes the illusion of control. It unsettles the ego's neat story. It reminds us that human connection is not easily filed away, not reducible to schedules or distance. When the absence hurts, it is because something in us still longs for wholeness. Something in us has not yet come home. And so this stage is painful, yes, but also necessary. It cracks the mask. It reveals the depth of what has been hidden. It pushes us to acknowledge that the soul does not heal by forgetting, but by facing. The fracture is the opening, and through it, the shadow begins to speak. The fracture has been felt, and now the mask begins to tighten. Outwardly, life continues with order and routine. The smile is offered. When expected, the words remain polite. The appearance of control carefully maintained. Yet beneath the surface, another story unfolds. The shadow presses against the edges of the persona, and the tension between them grows heavier each day. This is the quiet war within. The persona is the mask the image shaped for the world. It insists on dignity, strength, independence. It resists vulnerability at all costs, afraid that showing need will appear as weakness. But the shadow is not so easily silenced. It whispers in dreams. It intrudes in sudden emotions. It waits for stillness to speak its truth. The more the mask hardens, the louder the whisper becomes. Consider the way this tension shows itself in daily life. A woman insists she has moved on, yet her body betrays her with a tightening chest when a familiar name is spoken. A man claims he feels nothing but a single song sends him spiraling into memory. The mask speaks with denial, but the shadow speaks with symbols. And it is the shadow that tells the truth. Jung taught that what we refuse to face does not disappear. It gathers strength in the unconscious. The persona seeks approval, but the shadow demands honesty. This inner conflict is not a flaw. It is a sign that the psyche is asking for integration. When the mask and the shadow are at war, the soul becomes restless. Energy leaks out in unexpected ways. Sudden anger, unexplainable sadness, or the heavy silence that follows every attempt to suppress what is real. This stage is costly because it requires energy to maintain the mask. Pretending to be healed, pretending not to care, pretending the fracture has left no mark. These are efforts of the ego, and they drain the vitality of the soul. Yet at the same time, surrendering fully to longing feels dangerous, like losing oneself to a wound that may never close. And so the person is caught between two poles: the persona that insists on control and the shadow that demands recognition. Many carry this conflict in secret. To friends and family, they appear steady and composed. But inwardly, their dreams are filled with faces, their hearts echo with unfinished conversations, and their intuition whispers that something unresolved still ties them to the other. The world sees the mask, but the inner life bears the weight of the shadow. This gap between outer appearance and inner truth becomes the breeding ground for suffering. At times, the mask itself becomes cruel. It mocks the soul for still caring. It calls the longing foolish, childish, unnecessary. But this is the voice of the persona defending itself, fearing exposure. The shadow, in contrast, does not ridicule. It only insists, see me, hear me, integrate me. Jung wrote that the shadow contains not only what is dark, but also what is vital and alive. To reject it entirely is to reject part of the self. The stakes here are clear. If the persona wins, the soul becomes divided, brittle, disconnected from its deeper currents. If the shadow overwhelms without guidance, the person risks drowning in sorrow or obsession. The path of individuation, the path toward wholeness, requires a different response. It asks us to face the shadow without collapsing into it, and to soften the mask without losing dignity. This balance is difficult, yet it is the only way the fracture can become an opening instead of a prison. Notice how symbols often surface during this stage. Mirrors, doors, unfinished letters, or recurring dreams appear, each carrying the message that something within remains unseen. These are invitations from the unconscious, urging us to look more closely. To ignore them is to deepen the split. To attend to them is to begin the process of healing. The conflict between persona and shadow is not a mistake. It is a passage. It shows us where our identity has grown too rigid, where we have sacrificed truth for appearance. It forces us to confront what we most fear, that our longing reveals vulnerability, that our silence hides unspoken need, that our independence sometimes conceals loneliness. Yet it is precisely here in this recognition that transformation begins to stir. For now, the war remains unresolved. The mask still insists on composure. The shadow still whispers of unfinished bonds. The soul stands between them, weary of the struggle but unable to escape it. This is the necessary tension before awakening. The fracture has exposed what is hidden, and the inner conflict makes denial impossible. Something must shift, but the way forward is not yet clear. When the tension between mask and shadow becomes unbearable, something inside begins to shift. It is not a sudden explosion, but a slow turning, like the way dawn creeps into a room before anyone notices the light. The soul grows weary of denial. It begins to search for another way, a path not built on pretending or suppressing, but on listening. This is the moment of awakening. It often arrives in quiet symbols, a dream that feels more real than waking life, a repeated image that seems to follow you, or a sudden intuition that refuses to be ignored. The unconscious has been speaking all along, but now the psyche is ready to hear. What once felt like torment begins to reveal itself as guidance. Jung reminded us that the unconscious is not only the repository of what we fear, it is also the source of renewal, the wellspring of symbols that point us toward wholeness. The shadow once seen only as an enemy now becomes a teacher. Its whispers are no longer attacks, but invitations to look deeper. The very feelings we tried to bury contain the seeds of transformation. At first, this recognition feels fragile. A woman may notice she no longer trembles when a memory surfaces. A man may realize he can hear a song tied to the past without collapsing into grief. These are small but profound openings. They show that the psyche is beginning to integrate what was once split. The mask loosens, the shadow speaks more clearly, and the self grows strong enough to hold both. Awakening means seeing signs for what they are, symbols of energy, not demands for action. A dream of the one who has been lost does not always mean reconciliation. A sudden pull of longing does not always call for return. Instead, these experiences remind us that a bond once shaped the soul, and its echo still vibrates within. The work is not to chase the echo, but to understand what it awakens inside. Here, the contrast becomes clear. The persona says, ignore it, prove your strength. The shadow says, fall into it completely. But the awakened self whispers, attend to it and let it teach you. This is the voice of individuation, the process of becoming whole, where we no longer identify only with the mask, nor collapse into the wound, but stand at the center, able to hold both truth and longing without losing ourselves. In this stage, synchronicities often appear. Coincidences that feel too precise, moments that seem charged with hidden meaning. They can be disorienting, as though the universe itself conspires to remind you of what you are trying to forget. But awakening shifts the perspective. These synchronicities are not chains pulling you back into the past. They are mirrors showing where unfinished energy still moves in the soul. Seen with clarity, they no longer demand obsession. They invite reflection. The awakening is not the end of pain, but the beginning of understanding. It does not erase the longing, but it gives it context. Absence is no longer only a wound. It becomes a symbol of the places within that still call for attention. In learning to read these inner signs, one discovers that silence itself has meaning. It carries messages not about what the other must do, but about what the self is ready to learn. Jung spoke of the self as the center, the guiding principle of the psyche that seeks balance and completeness. Awakening is when you feel the pull of that center more strongly than the pull of pride or fear. Instead of denying the dream or drowning in it, you begin to ask, what is this symbol teaching me about my own wholeness? The longing ceases to be only about the other and becomes a compass pointing inward. This realization changes the way absence is carried. It no longer feels like emptiness that must be filled. It becomes a presence in its own right, a reminder that love once awakened parts of you that still live waiting for integration. The fracture that once seemed like a curse now shows itself as an opening a door through which deeper self-knowledge enters. Awakening is fragile. It requires patience, humility, and gentleness. The mask will still try to harden. The shadow will still whisper with intensity. But now you see them both, and that vision itself brings freedom. For when you can recognize the forces within without identifying completely with them, you stand closer to your true self. In this stage, many discover a new sense of dignity. Not the brittle dignity of denial, but the calm dignity of truth. You no longer need to convince anyone of your strength. You simply live it by allowing your soul to hold both loss and hope without collapsing into either. This is the first taste of inner authority, the kind that does not depend on outside recognition. The awakening does not announce itself with fanfare. It moves quietly like a river, changing its course. Yet in its silence, it alters everything. You no longer measure worth by who stays or who leaves. You no longer confuse absence with rejection. You begin to sense that the true journey is not toward another person's return, but toward your own wholeness. This is where the real work begins. Not the frantic effort of chasing signs, but the steady practice of listening. Listening to dreams, to intuition, to the subtle movements of the heart. Listening without clinging, without demanding, without fear. And in this listening, the soul discovers a truth that both liberates and humbles. Every bond that leaves an imprint also carries a lesson. And the lesson is never about loss alone. It is about the deeper self that emerges through it. Awakening shows us that absence carries meaning, but transformation requires more. At some point, recognition must turn into choice. The psyche can no longer linger in silent waiting, hoping that the outside world will restore what was lost. A boundary must be drawn not to shut out love, but to protect the dignity of the self. This boundary is not about anger or rejection. It is about reclaiming energy that has been poured endlessly into longing. When you stop feeding the shadow with denial or obsession, you redirect that power inward. What once drained you begins to sustain you. Jung taught that individuation requires such choices, the willingness to face what binds you, and then to choose a different relation to it. In this moment, silence is redefined. It no longer stands as a prison filled with unanswered questions. It becomes a container, a space where the soul can breathe without chasing echoes. To stop waiting at the door is not to deny the bond that was real. It is to honor it by no longer allowing it to dictate the rhythm of your present life. The choice to set a boundary often feels frightening. For years, the unconscious may have whispered that wholeness will return only if the other does. Letting go of that hope feels like stepping into emptiness. But this is precisely where transformation happens. By refusing to wait endlessly, you encounter the part of yourself that has been waiting too for your attention, your care, your presence. The soul begins to recognize that its greatest reunion is not with another, but with itself. Notice the contrast here. The persona still wants to prove strength by pretending nothing hurts. The shadow still pulls toward longing with relentless intensity. But the true self takes another path. It does not deny the past, nor collapse into it. It sets a boundary. I will not let my worth be measured by whether someone returns. I will not hand over my freedom to what I cannot control. This is not coldness. It is clarity. Boundaries are not walls built against love. They are doors that decide what enters and what does not. When you create this door, you are no longer at the mercy of every memory, every dream, every unexpected sign. You acknowledge them, but you no longer obey them. You choose your response, and in that choice, you reclaim authority over your inner life. Jung often described individuation as the process of moving from outer authority to inner authority. In this stage, you stop waiting for the outside world to affirm your worth. You stop demanding that the past provide closure. Instead, you create closure through the act of living. You transform absence into presence, not by filling the gap with noise, but by filling your own life with what is meaningful and true. This transformation often reveals itself in subtle shifts. You notice that you no longer reach for the phone late at night, hoping for a message that will never come. You decline to replay the same memories in circles of regret. You no longer accept crumbs of attention that once felt like enough. These small refusals are not bitterness. They are boundaries that protect the sacredness of your soul. The cost of this choice is real. It may bring moments of grief sharper than before, as though finally admitting the truth cuts more deeply than denial ever did. But this grief is clean. It is not the heavy repetition of obsession. It is the honest sorrow that clears space for something new. Every boundary drawn creates a field where new life can grow. Here lies the paradox. When you no longer beg for signs, you become free to see them with clarity. A dream appears, a coincidence unfolds, and instead of grasping you, simply notice. The symbols are still alive, but they no longer enslave you. They remind you of the depth of your humanity, not of your dependency on another. Boundaries also change the way love itself is understood. You realize love is not meant to strip you of dignity or demand endless waiting. Love that requires the annihilation of self is not love at all. By choosing self-respect, you do not close the heart. You open it to a different quality of connection, one that honors both the bond and the individual, one that allows intimacy without erasing identity. This choice is an act of courage, especially for those who have long equated sacrifice with love. But Jung would remind us, individuation is the art of becoming whole, not of dissolving into another. To set a boundary is not selfish. It is the necessary step that allows true connection to flourish. Only when the self is secure can love be freely given. As this transformation deepens, a new stability emerges. You are no longer tossed between persona and shadow denial and obsession. You stand at the center, able to acknowledge the pain without being consumed by it. You discover the quiet strength that comes from saying no to what diminishes you, and yes to what affirms your wholeness. And so the soul begins to walk differently, not leaning against the past, not waiting for the future, but standing in the present with clarity. The fracture that once seemed unbearable becomes the very ground on which a new life is built. What was once silence filled with longing becomes silence filled with presence. And this is the gift of boundary, the ability to carry memory with honor while stepping forward in freedom. Every journey through longing eventually arrives at this truth. Closure does not mean forgetting, and healing does not mean erasing. What was real leaves an imprint, and the soul carries it forward, not as a chain, but as a mark of depth. The heart often resists this stage. It clings to the hope that final peace must come from an outside word, an apology, a return, an explanation. Yet Jung reminded us that wholeness does not depend on what others offer. It is born from what we integrate within ourselves. The story does not end when another closes the door. It ends when you choose to live in freedom. This is the moment when memory changes shape. Instead of stabbing like a wound, it softens into presence. The absence you once feared becomes a quiet teacher. It reminds you of the parts of yourself that awakened through love, even if that love did not last in form. The scar is not shame. It is proof that your heart was alive, that it reached beyond itself, that it touched something eternal. Forgiveness often emerges here, not as a gift to another, but as liberation for the self. You no longer need to rehearse the past or carry the weight of blame. You can see that the other also carried shadows, fears, and limitations. They too struggled to love with the tools they had. This understanding does not excuse everything, but it allows you to set it down. Forgiveness, in this sense, is not agreement, it is release. It is the freeing of energy to be used for your own becoming. And with release comes compassion. You look back on your own journey, the tears, the waiting, the restless nights, and you see not weakness, but courage. The fact that you felt deeply was never a flaw. It was the soul's way of reminding you that you are alive. The tenderness that remains is not a burden, it is your treasure. Now you stand differently. You no longer wait at the threshold of someone else's silence. You no longer beg the unconscious for signs to confirm your worth. You have learned to create light in your own room, to be a refuge to yourself. This is the fruit of individuation, the ability to hold your own depth without needing constant validation from another. From this ground, love itself transforms. It is no longer driven by fear of losing or by the hunger to be completed. It flows from abundance, from the joy of sharing, rather than the ache of grasping. Connection, when it arrives again, is not about possession, but about presence. Two souls meeting with honesty, without masks, without chains. Closure, then, is not the end of feeling. It is the integration of feeling. It is the shift from being ruled by longing to being guided by it. You recognize the sacred role of memory, but you no longer let it define your future. The echo of the past becomes music, not a command. It deepens you without binding you. This is the final paradox. What once broke you becomes what remakes you. The same absence that threatened to undo you becomes the ground on which you stand whole. You walk forward, not in bitterness, but in quiet strength. You carry tenderness without shame. You love without losing yourself. And so the soul is free. Free to remember without pain. Free to love without fear. Free to step into tomorrow without dragging yesterday as a weight. Jung once said that the task of life is not to become perfect, but to become whole. That wholeness now lives within you, not as an idea, but as presence and as depth, as peace. As we close, let this reflection stay with you. The connections that truly matter do not vanish. They transform. They become part of the inner architecture of your being, shaping the way you see, the way you feel, the way you love. And even when people come and go, what you discovered within yourself remains. Take a breath here. Notice the silence around you. Let it not be absence, but presence. The kind of presence that tells you the journey was not in vain. For every shadow faced, every boundary set, and every tear honored has led you here to a self, more real, more free, more alive. If this spoke to you tonight, I invite you to share in the comments what part of this journey echoed most deeply in your own life. And if these reflections help you walk with more clarity and calm, consider joining again for more. For now, let this truth remain. Love may pass, but what it awakens endures. Wholeness is not found by clinging, but by becoming. And the most important reunion is always with yourself.